everyone, it's Dr. Wisner, and I'm going to try this out and see how this works. Hopefully this will work fine, and then if we need to do this for the week after, or if you prefer to have it done this way rather than zooming in and things like that for the week after, let me know, and I can make that happen. This won't be a full class, like I mentioned. But I just want to kind of get wrap your brains around the beginnings of the Renaissance, and talk a little bit about the basic concepts of the Renaissance, how they work with things like art, architecture, and all of that, because that will be really important as we continue our discussion of the 15th and 16th century. So, first and foremost, the Renaissance is a term that was actually coined after the actual period started. And like I've mentioned in multiple cases, nobody woke up and said, okay, 1300, we are now in the Renaissance. Now we are facing some difficulties with periodization. When we are talking about period and talking about style, what we're talking about is just matching style and aesthetics. So this is important because nobody can really agree when the Renaissance actually first started. There are some roots in Renaissance ideas in things like the Ars Nova and the Ars Superior. So in some ways, we think about it as being started in the 1300s, 14th century. But in other cases, it's actually a little bit later. If you study any other discipline like art or architecture or literature, you actually probably find that the Renaissance begins in different places depending on what discipline you're in. And again, this is basically about aesthetics and nothing else. So what are we working with here? There were really several important things that are happening in the Renaissance. First and foremost, we've been talking so far about how musical style is different in Italy and Germany and France and England. That's not going to be the case anymore. Now what we have is what we can think of as an international or a cosmopolitan style. And this is because composers are going to travel all over the place. Nobody's going to stay still. And most of the composers who are going to be big names in the Renaissance are actually going to be trained in what we know of, or what we call, the Low Countries. So the Netherlands, Belgium, a place called Flanders, yes, as in Ned Flanders, and also France. And then they're going to go and they're going to compose and work in courts and things like that in various places, especially in Italy. And because composers are traveling all over the place and working in multiple places, what's going to happen is they're going to pick up stylistic traits that they like. And that is going to work its way into music. And so there's going to be a blurring of boundaries. So we can no longer say that Italy is, there's an Italian style and French style and German style. There's kind of a little bit of everything. So, excuse me, that's the first thing. The second thing is we're going to continue to change what we think of as consonants and dissonants. In the Renaissance, thirds and sixths are now considered consonances, and they are going to become more important. So you're going to start to see music that is focusing on using thirds and sixths. Counterpoint is also going to be changed in terms of rules. So what's going to happen is you have to be able to use dissonance in a very specific way. If you don't, you're going to be considered a bad composer. And this is something you're going to see a little bit more of when you take History 2 next semester. For texture, the two main textures we're working with are homophony and imitative counterpoint. So just as a review, homophonic music is where all of the voices are singing in the same rhythm. And imitative counterpoint is where you have different voices singing very similar music in imitation. So those are going to be the two main types of music you will see throughout the Renaissance. With the Reformation, there are going to be changes there in terms of what happens with music. So at one point, the Catholic Church is going to kind of be splintered. It's going to have various offshoots. This is going to start with Martin Luther, with his 95 Theses and all of these grievances against the church. And then from there, you're going to have other Protestant churches like the Church of England, the Calvinist Church, the Presbyterian Church, and all of that. This is also going to necessitate new liturgies. So now we're not only just going to be working with the Catholic liturgy, we're going to have a lot of other liturgies to work with. And then finally, probably the most important development in music in the Renaissance has to do with the ability to print music. What's going to happen is Gutenberg is going to invent the printing press. Well, he's not going to invent the printing press, but the first person who is going to use the printing press, really, is Gutenberg. And he's going to print the Bible. But music printing is a bit more difficult to print, because unlike a book where you have a word on a page, we don't think of it really this way, but music is actually layered. You have a staff, and then on the staff you have various things like notes and clefs and other things like chords, and then you also can have words if it's vocal music. So how do you print all of those things? And it was a process of elimination to try and figure out the best way to print. The very first way that people started to print music was a really tedious way called double impression printing. And what this meant was people would print the staff first, and then they would put the paper back in the printing press, and then try and print the notes and the words in a second impression. The problem with this is something that you all have probably faced if you've ever tried to load paper in a printer. If you don't load the paper properly, if you load it slightly crooked, the printing will be slightly crooked. So if you don't load the paper in a printing press precisely, what's going to happen is the notes are not going to be able to be printed on the right staff, the right line. The right space or the right line. Sorry, it's been a really long day of conferencing, so my brain is mush. You're not going to have everything in the right place. And so that became a waste of resources. You're wasting paper, you're wasting ink, you're wasting time. So they came up with a better system. And this better system was taking little pieces of movable type that had a staff and a note already on it. And then you put it in the machine. So it's very similar to what you would do if you were printing a word, where you would letter by letter, except in this case it would be note by note. And then you have everything in the right place. The downside to this is that you have to load it into the machine upside down and backwards. If you don't, it's not going to come out right. So you have to literally think upside down and backwards. There is a link on the Week 7 PowerPoint about music printing. It's about 10 minutes. And so at some point after you watch this, I would like you to watch that video with a Vimeo link. And it shows you these teeny tiny pieces of movable type and how this actually worked with printing. So you can get a sense as to how the very first music books were printed. Why is this important? It's important because now you can circulate music faster and cheaper. So what's going to happen is people are no longer going to be passing around manuscripts. They're going to print music, and music is going to be used as a commodity. So you can buy it, you can sell it, you can trade it. You can also import it or export it. So this is how we get music from, say, Spain to the New World, or from England eventually to the colonies, because you have these printed objects that are fast and easily and cheaply mass-produced. which you don't have with manuscripts. And these are things that we kind of take for granted now, but back then they were really, really big deals. So what's happening politically at this point? The Great Schism is now over, where you have one pope again. 100 Years' War is going to end. Constantinople is going to fall to the Ottoman Turks. And then, once you have all of these things resolved, there are some new things happening, including the Reformation, and then the Turks are conquering the Balkans and Hungary. So again, more fighting and more kind of confusion. Columbus is going to terribly, quote-unquote, discover America in 1492, and this is going to lead to colonies being established in the Americas. And Europeans are also expanding their colonies. For the economy, at least in Europe, middle class is starting to become much more important. And trade is also going to become something that is predominantly done in terms of the economy. So people who have specialized services or products or anything really are going to be able to trade between cities and towns, the urban and the suburban. All of that's going to happen. This is where things get really, really good for artists, and by artists I mean musicians and painters and sculptors and anyone in the arts. Once the European economy begins to stabilize, the courts are going to have lots of money, and they're going to want to show off all the money they have. And so kings and all of these other rulers are going to be building really big houses. They're going to be building really big palaces. And as a result, they're going to want to decorate them. And so they're going to hire the best artists and artisans to make things like stained glass windows and sculptures and paintings and tapestries and all of that other stuff. But it doesn't stop there. They also want the best entertainment, so they're going to hire the best musicians. So they're also going to build chapels in their palaces, as was common back then. And of course, these chapels need musicians, so they're going to have fully staffed chapels. Now, this is where musicians become commodities, because in the Renaissance, one of the reasons why composers traveled so often was because the people who had money, like kings, would often try and prove how strong they were by flaunting their wealth. And they would flaunt their wealth by saying, hey, I hear you're a great composer. I want you to come work for me full-time and like either run my chapel, write music for me, whatever it was. A neighboring ruler would get wind that that composer would be working for a rival court and say, hey, I hear you're working for this rival court. Why don't you work for me for more money? And then that person would go and move to that court. And then this would happen over and over and over again. So nobody would really stay still. So musicians are being used really as a commodity to be bought and sold, just like sheet music is, except it's actually for the gain of the composer. And one of the things that is really closely related to this is this thing called humanism that I've been talking about for the past few weeks. So humanism, again, is this grand idea that you are focusing on the abilities of humanity and human beings rather than praying to God to have all of your problems solved. So first thing is we are now back in another period where people are looking back to the ancient Greeks, as they seem to do every couple of hundred years or so. And people are learning Greek. They're learning other languages so that they can translate the stuff from ancient Greek into Latin and then eventually into vernacular. So as a result, for the very first time, we have the works of some of the greatest ancient Greek writers like Plato and Aristotle translated into languages that people could understand. and this is going to allow for these ideas to be disseminated relatively easily. So, one thing that has changed very much between the Renaissance and now is that in the Renaissance, people who were humanists or subscribed to this idea that humans have knowledge and reason that can be capitalized on and used for good, is that you have to be a well-rounded person in order to be a good citizen. The humanities are going to prepare you for a life of service and a life of good deeds. Not anymore, of course. We know the humanities are under attack, and we know that humanities are often the first things to get cut. But in the Renaissance, this was the core belief. They said you had to be just as good as things like grammar and the ability to make speeches and rhetoric. No history, no poetry, no philosophy, no music, no art. And this is where we get this idea of the Renaissance man, or the well-rounded person that is basically good at everything. And this is really coming from this principle. The church at this point really wasn't sure what to do, because humanists were basically advocating that the church couldn't do much for you, that we can rely on our own selves rather than relying on God. So as a result, the church said, well, we have two options. We can keep doing what we're doing and then lose adherents, or we can get with the program and see what we do. And so what they did was they started to borrow from some of these ancient Greek sources and start to subscribe to some of the ideas of humanism. And they basically didn't really lose any adherents. So one thing that we're going to find even more now in the Renaissance than we did in the medieval period is there's going to be a closer relationship between art and music. And so one of your response papers is going to be asking you to find connections between music and other disciplines from one of the readings. And so when I say other disciplines, I mean anything you study that's not music. So it can be medicine, it can be poetry, it can be architecture, anything like that. And all of these things are going to be really closely related, starting with returning to these ideas of the ancient Greeks. Everything has to be very natural. It has to be based on reality. So, for instance, in the Renaissance, we find a lot of nude statues. This is contrasting with the fully covered idea of shame and things like that in the medieval period. And it has to be concentrating really on the human body and its beauty. Musicians are going to go back to theoretical treatises of people like Plato and Aristotle and Pythagoras and all of them to try and figure out what their definition of beauty was and use that. So this is where things get close when we're talking about painting and music. So there's two really important developments in art at this point. One has to do with perspective. So it sounds obvious to us, but if you're painting something, it needs to have a sense of depth. In the medieval period, pretty much everything that was painted was very flat, had no sense of depth, didn't have things like shadows. Everything just was one-dimensional. So in the Renaissance, that all goes away. You have a sense of perspective. You also have this focus on individuality. So in painting, this is reflected by more realistic figures who are minor in paintings. So in a medieval period painting, you might get a minor figure that's like a dot with like another dot for hair, and that's it. In the Renaissance, they actually focus their attention on giving these minor characters faces. It's all about attention to detail. So individual figures are going to be treated just as equally as the main figures in a painting. They're going to have depth. They're going to have shadow. They're going to have faces with emotions. This is also going to be translated into the fact that many major figures, composers included, are going to have paintings of themselves made. So again, concentrating on the individual. Even memorial pieces of music are going to be composed for composers who have died. The other development in art is this thing we call chiaroscuro, which means light and dark, essentially, or light and shade. This means that you are actually using the way light and shadow works in order to create a much more realistic painting. And the other thing that's going to happen is that there's going to be a very clean use of lines in architecture. So just to kind of show you how this works, this is a medieval painting. You can kind of see, you'll probably be able to see it a little bit better on your Week 7 PowerPoint, but you can kind of see things are not really that ornate, not that detailed in faces. But here's something that we get that's pretty important. We're going to start to get something called a vanishing point. I'm going to try and illustrate this with my mouse, but if it doesn't come through as well, then I can certainly demonstrate for you when I get back in 2 weeks. When we're talking about perspective, we're talking about this idea that something that is farther away is going to be smaller than something that's closer to you. Again, seems obvious to us now, not so obvious in the 15th century. So the vanishing point is where you basically have a point in the center of the painting which you're drawing attention to. So here's this way and that way, kind of like an upside down V. Your focus is this building right here, and you can kind of see how things are coming out from that. You can see the windows of these buildings in the back are smaller than these in the front, and that's exactly what we're talking about with a vanishing point. So it's this point that you're focusing on, kind of like the focal point, and then everything else is done in perspective from that. Same thing here. You could actually see with the treatment of shadow that Christ is not up against the wall. There's actually some space behind the crucifix. So that's another example of how this kind of works. And you can see, again, the smaller tiles in the back than in the front. And these minor figures have faces. So how does this work in music? First and foremost, the clean lines and the clarity of the way paintings are done is channeled through the clarity of musical form and musical structure and frequent uses of cadences. Not only are you going to have those, but you're also going to have stylistic contrast. So you might have one section within a form that sounds slightly different. Or you might have different meters, different keys. And again, I'm using keys here even though we're still in mode. So all of these things are going to tell you exactly where you are in the structure, which is paralleling the clean lines. Also, the musical equivalent of a vanishing point is a single tonal center. And one of the reasons why in the Renaissance we can start to hear things as if they are in keys rather than in modes is because a lot of the composers are going to compose pieces with tonal centers, or modal centers I should say, around A and C, which equates to our major and minor. And it's actually in the late Renaissance that you get the addition of 2 more modes to the 8 we already have, and this is Ionian and Aeolian, or what we now know is major and minor. So that focus on one tonal center is the equivalent of the vanishing point. With the light and the dark, that's going to happen through an expansion of range. So lower registers will get lower, higher registers will get higher, and so you have this contrast between range so that you have this kind of musical sonic light and dark. And then, of course, this interest in individual composers is going to be reflected in some of these musical works, and then also some of the styles of certain composers. Certain composers of the Renaissance, say like Dufay, who we'll study in a couple of weeks, has his own sonic fingerprint. You can kind of tell like a Dufay piece when you hear it. So there's a lot of stuff that's actually going on right now. And when we get to this idea of what musicians are doing, I mentioned again that musicians kind of were passed off like commodities. Many of them worked in court chapels. If you worked at a court chapel, you were on a salary, so you had no worries at all. Just because you worked for a court chapel did not mean the only thing you did was perform for church services. If you were a musician at any court in any capacity, you could be called on to do anything. So if you were a chapel musician who was originally hired to perform masses, it is very likely that if that person you were working for was having a dinner party and decided to have like musicians for entertainment, they would ask you to come in and perform for secular music for entertainment. Some of them also did things like work as servants or whatever. So they really got their money out of the musician that they were hiring. So whatever salary you got, you basically had to say yes to whatever they asked you to do. For music education, boys were the ones who were educated. They would often go to choir schools that were situated in cathedrals. They would teach them everything from math and science and rhetoric to music theory and how to sing and how to compose. And again, it's notable that the main composers of this time came from the centers of musical training where a lot of these choir schools were. And again, you'll notice that they're from the area of France and the Low Countries. But Venice and Rome also became centers of musical training. And if you were a girl, chances are the only way you could get any sort of musical training is one of two ways. One, you could be in a convent becoming a nun, or two, you can be an orphan and in an orphanage. And that's really the only two ways any sort of women would have any training as musicians. But again, it was also expected that once they left the confines of either the orphanage, or once they left the confines of the orphanage, they would become wives and mothers and not use any of their musical training. And for the girls in the convents, they would use them for masses. If you were an instrumentalist, you were trained in a system that is not very different from now. You'd be trained in the apprentice system. So you'd study with a teacher, and you'd learn their craft, and then you'd kind of go off on your way. The only difference is that in the Renaissance, if you studied with, if you were an apprentice, you would actually live with your teacher, which for some of you might actually be a horrifying thought. The other thing that's really new and important is the role of patronage in the Renaissance. So now many composers are making their money by working for different courts. And again, they're really traveling all over the place. And there's this competition for the best composer. It doesn't really matter where they came from. Most of them studied in the same place. But there was such a similar style with all the composers with their cosmopolitan and international style that it didn't really matter. And so composers could really write music in any particular style because they were trained to do that and they were able to do that. Thirds and sixths, again, are more important. And we start to get more contemporary theoretical works like Tinctoris, and then Zarlino. both of whom basically talk about the elevations of thirds and sixths and all of these new developments in music. By the time you get to the second half of the 15th century, all of the voices are equal. So in the medieval period, you would get where the top voice had the melody and then the other voices are kind of supporting roles. Not anymore. In the medieval period, composers would think about the relationship between the top voice and the tenor, or the contrast and the tenor. Again, no longer doing that. Now, composers are writing music with all of the voices at the same time. This is what's going to create these two predominant textures. Now we're thinking vertically rather than horizontally when we're composing. Temperament and tuning is going to be slightly complicated. We're going to talk a little bit more about this as we go along. But because thirds and sixths are more important now, you have to find systems that actually make these things in tune. So there's a couple of ways that people try to tune things in the Renaissance. The first way was Pythagorean intonation. With Pythagorean intonation, your fourths and fifths are in tune, but your thirds and sixths are not in tune. Then they realized that's not going to work, and then they tried just intonation, where your thirds and sixths are in tune, but your fourths and fifths are out of tune. It's also worth noting that different instruments had different tuning systems, which could make things ever so slightly complicated in terms of playing in consorts. In the Renaissance, a group of musicians or instrumental chamber music is known as consort music. Consorts were typically ensembles of the same instrument, so you can have a viola da gamba consort, a crumhorn consort, a recorder consort, that sort of thing. But you could also have mixed consorts, or what we can call broken consorts, where you might have one recorder, a crumhorn, two gambas, whatever. And so this is where the tuning gets a little bit wonky, because instruments typically were sold in chests where they were tuned to one another. But now you not only have instruments that are not tuned to each other playing at the same time, but you also have different instruments with different tuning systems. So if you ever listen to a recording of an early music ensemble with period instruments that were built in the Renaissance, it can sound a little bit weird. So the idea was that you would tune depending on whatever would make you sound better. Violinists and other string players know this, singers may know this, but the human voice and string instruments are capable of playing G sharps versus A flats, for instance. Sharps and flats are actually two different notes. On the piano, there's the same note, but in reality, there are two different notes, and you could actually replicate that if you were a singer or a string player. But keyboards couldn't do this, so they had to find ways to kind of make this happen. So then you get mean tone temperament, which really kind of becomes standard, in which you have fifths tuned slightly smaller than perfect, so that you can actually use the black keys without the thirds and the sixths and things like that sounding weird. But again, it's all about sounding. So again, humanist principles, let's rely on our ears rather than anything else, and that will determine how you deal with things like temperament. Form fiques by this point are becoming old-fashioned, and when composers are setting text, they're actually paying attention to the way the text is spoken and putting the right emphasis on the right syllable. And cadences are also going to have different levels of finality. So, for instance, we all know that a 5/1 cadence is the strongest kind of cadence. But, say, a deceptive cadence or a plagal cadence are not as strong. So you'll get to a part of the piece where you might have the text set with commas, and there you might have a 4/1 or a 5/6 or something like that, instead of a final cadence. So the less strong the sentence or the part of the sentence in the context, the less strong the cadence will be. And so composers are now also thinking about how to make the music dramatize the text. And we're going to see a lot of this when we get to the Baroque next semester. But you're going to start to see something we called word painting or madrigalism, in which the music is reflecting what's in the text. So for instance, if you are singing the words running, you might have faster notes than you had before. If you have the word heaven, you might get higher notes than before. So it's about making the music reflect what is in the text. And so just like the writings of people like Plato and Aristotle are coming to Western Europe, the writings on music are also coming to Western Europe. And what's happening is theorists are starting to look at this stuff and kind of modify it and modernize it. One of the first people to do this was Gaudio, who took ideas from the ancient Greeks and incorporated them into his treatise. Talked about everything from modes to tuning to how to deal with consonants and dissonances. And then you get Glareanus. Glareanus was the one who added the two extra modes, Aeolian and Ionian, because a lot of composers were using A and C as their tonal center. One of the things that is going to come out, especially here, is that people are going to be looking more and more on music as a social accomplishment, that it is part of being a well-rounded person, that it is ideal for you to be able to, say, play the lute while singing. And they're also going back to some of the things that the ancient Greeks said, where music has an emotional power. Certain modes had certain power to make you do things, make you feel things, and all of that stuff. So here's where I'm adding that little Easter egg, just to let me know that you watched this video. At some point, just send me an email, and I want you to just tell me whether or not you think that music has the power to alter someone's emotion or thought process. So, for instance, Plato said that if you want to be contemplative, you will use one mode. If you want to be somebody who is even-tempered, you will use another mode. If you want to be somebody who is virtuous and upright, you will use another mode. So I want you to just drop me a quick, one-sentence answer and let me know what you think. Do you think that music can change someone's disposition just by the type or mode that somebody's listening to? So for the Renaissance, there are these applications of Greek ideas that include these ideas where mode can create certain emotional or dispositional effects. And they're also attempting to bring back the chromatic genus, which was used in ancient Greek music. The problem with the chromatic genus is it could be a little bit difficult to listen to. Not as difficult as the enharmonic genus, but it could be slightly difficult. But this is where we get our idea of chromaticism. We're using all 12 tones of the scale. And so here is where we talk a little bit about printing. One thing that's important to note that I didn't mention before is that when you have single impression printed, where you have the staff and the notes and the text all together in one, you'll have these little gaps in text. And again, if you look at the PowerPoint on your end, it might be a little bit easier to see than here. But you can see, probably, that there are little gaps, and sometimes things are just not level with one another. And that happens because of the way that the machine moves when you close the printing press and stuff like that. The very first collection that we have of printed music was by Petrucci. Petrucci had a monopoly on music so that you could not print music in Italy if you were not him. The very first collection was the Othecaton A from 1501, called 100 Pieces of Music. The problem was it was false advertising. There were only 96 pieces in the collection. He also had Othecaton B and C later on. But it was the first collection of polyphonic music to be printed from movable type. And it was done in part books. So if you remember the first class when we looked at the part books where one part is in each book, this was the other thing that Petrucci did, where he sold the part books separately. So you had to buy each book individually. So these amateurs would use part books for home gatherings. Basically, you could buy different part books and sing around your dinner table after dinner and all of that good stuff. Just like you see here. And there was really no one way to do it, so you could have people singing and playing and doubling and whatever you wanted to. So this is where we start to get music as a commodity. Composers could make money. Music by certain composers could be distributed all throughout Europe and the New World and all that other stuff. And there's now a demand for new musical styles, so people are starting to write new types of music and write various different kinds of music for different ensembles. And so as more people wanted music, more music would be composed and kind of rinse and repeat and that sort of thing. But this also allows us to have a lot more surviving music from the Renaissance than we had before in the medieval period. So we can actually study this sort of stuff. But the downside is it's all in Renaissance notation, which people have to learn to read. And the thing with Renaissance notation is it can get slightly complicated because things don't quite fit the way we expect them to fit. So it becomes not easy. And because not everybody can transcribe this stuff correctly, if you want to perform a piece from the Renaissance, you have two options. One, you can do it yourself from the manuscript or the original notation, or you can find a version and just make sure that's actually correctly done. So this is the video that I was talking about that I'd like you to watch. And so a couple more things that has to do with notation. On NYU classes, under lessons, there should be something that says white mensural notation. You can use that as a guide. At the end of this PowerPoint, there are two examples of pieces in Renaissance notation with the solution right after it. And I want you to be very, very careful about thinking about how this works. I am not going to be concerned with you doing this with bar lines because, again, things don't quite fit the way you might imagine that they fit. So when you do your practice transcription, what I really want you to do is focus again on pitches and rhythms rather than grouping things into bars. And the same would apply for the final when you have extra credit of this kind of transcription. So what we're working with are mensural notation that's really growing out of the rhythmic modes. And we still have those combinations of time and prolation. So just kind of as a reminder here. But what we have now is called white mensural notation. And the reason why we have white mensural notation is because they are getting rid of certain black notes, and it has to do with the parchment on which, the paper on which things were being printed. So now that you're no longer really using parchment, you don't necessarily have to have black notes everywhere. So this is essentially what this would look like. Just again, as a word, that little about things. First of all, here is a clef. So these are C clefs, movable clefs. This here, the thing that looks like a flag and a figure 8, though that together forms your bass clef or your F clef. Here are your custos, which will tell you what note comes on the next staff, and then everything else, your time signatures. The other thing you need to know is your rests. So this thing here, this little line, these big lines here, these are all rests. Rests can be very easily confused with dots, especially with this kind of notation, because when you have bleed through, it becomes a little bit difficult sometimes to tell what's a dot and what's not. So just be very careful about that. Also, the number of lines and whether or not it's touching both ends of each line will tell you whether or not, will tell you what kind of staff you have. So just so you can kind of see how this works, this is where we are with Whiteman's rule notation, and this is what the equivalent is. You'll also notice that we start to get smaller note values. So by the end of the 16th century, we have the round note heads. You still don't have bar lines, which is another reason why I'm asking you not to use bar lines. But you also get smaller note values, such as the fusa and the semifusa, which are equivalent to our 8th and 16th notes. But here's what I mean by the rests. So here, for the semibrev, the top comes a little bit above the line and doesn't quite touch the line below it. That's a semibrev rest. Here, the minim rest, it touches the bottom but doesn't quite touch the top. So you have to be very careful to see, number one, how many lines you actually have in the rest. So for the maxima, you actually have 2 lines parallel to one another, where the long is only 1 line. And again, depends if you're in, say, 2 spaces or 1 space, or whatever. And so this is where we wind up. By the time we get to the end of the semester, we're actually getting to right here. So this is really the last kind of notation that we have. So for the rest of the class, I would like you to take some time to transcribe. You can use the Renaissance Whiteman's Rule Notation Guide. You can also use the guide for the rests and things that I have right here. Whatever works for you. The first example you're going to transcribe is this. Again, be careful for rests and anything else. And then the slide after that is the solution. And then this is the other one I want you to transcribe. This is an excerpt from Arbeau's Orchesography, which was a dance and music manual from the Renaissance. And we're going to be looking at orchesography at the end of the semester. You're going to have a response paper about it, but you've also looked at the orchesography the first day of class. So I just want to bring up one thing with this. Some of the notes are cut off. This has no stem, this last one here. And what else? This is a repeat sign. And then you just have to differentiate between rests and what's not. The solution for this, again, just really pay attention to the notes and the pitches and the rhythms. The time signature that's given for the solution here is completely false. And I put that there because I want you to kind of see what would happen if somebody who doesn't know what they're doing tries to plop a time signature on this with bar lines. So that gives you a sense as to how that works. So spend some time trying to transcribe both of those things. If you want to send me your transcription, you can. You don't necessarily have to. But again, what I do ask is for you to answer that little Easter egg question in an email to me. Any questions about anything that you have, please let me know. If you like this format, you can also drop me an email in that little Easter egg email letting me know. If you don't like the format, you can let me know that too, and I can, try and do a live class next week. But this is pretty much kind of your basic Renaissance stuff. So do the transcription, watch the 10-minute video, and then let me know if you have any questions, and have fun with the transcription.